What's the quote? I mean, the quote is, it's backyard wrestling. 10 years later.
Matt Wadsworth, let me introduce you to something that you've never been a part of, that you could very well soon be a part of, that right now, as I'm speaking, you are a part of. Welcome to Beyond Wrestling.
Beyond Wrestling was founded in May of 2009 in Elyria, Ohio. Beyond Wrestling was essentially born out of backyard wrestling. The studio tapings were Beyond Wrestling's bread and butter, where, you know, we created a legitimate sense of competition in what is otherwise considered to be a staged sport. Because instead of having fans present at the taping, the wrestlers were wrestling for each other. And the wrestlers know all of the tricks of the trade. So in order to really impress your peers, you have to pull out all the stops. But if you can put together a match that's going to impress another wrestler, then that's something that a fan would certainly want to see. And so, you know, each match after the next one, guys wanted to go out and try and top one another. They wanted to have the craziest performance that they were capable of, because it was also a networking opportunity. There was wrestlers from all over the country that were competing on these studio tapings, and it was like, you know, hey, if you have this crazy match with Davey Vega in St. Louis, you know, and you're from New Jersey, that may create an opportunity for you to be able to go wrestle for St. Louis Anarchy. Nobody got paid, but it was almost like a resume builder, and that's when we turned to YouTube and started putting up the matches for free. Because guys could share and be like, hey, you know, maybe this is how I'm presented, you know, in Jersey All-Pro, but this is what I'm capable of if I'm in charge of the way that I'm presented.
And he's going to be going one-on-one here against Haley Hatred.
Wrestling, motherfucker, that's what's going down. That's all that's going down, right?
Just even within that first year, companies like Absolute Intense Wrestling and Evolve Wrestling, using guys like Eric Alvarado and Chris Dickinson and Team Beyond, really legitimized what we were doing. Next step for that was producing a DVD and putting it on Smart Mark Video, because why would Smart Mark Video release Backyard Wrestling? And it just got to the point where, you know, through our social media, which, you know, we were relying on because it was a free way to promote our shows, we thought there was enough demand to do a live event. So we did our first live show in 2011 with Interspecies Wrestling in Danbury, Connecticut. It was just kind of an exciting thing that we wanted to continue to replicate. Places like Chikara, places like Dragon Gate USA, they were legitimized by the fact that they were touring around the country. So we tried to take that approach at first by running shows in different locations, never really in front of large crowds. At that same time, I started taking notice of what was happening with Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and how, you know, they were drawing sellout crowds every single event just by having one base of operations. You know, from 2013, 2014, we pretty much started off doing shows every other month at FET until settling into doing basically monthly shows. I think at that point we kind of realized, like, we can't just be reliant on one venue. And, you know, even though FET Music was Beyond Wrestling's identity for a long period of time, you know, the goals can continue to get bigger and bigger, and at that point it's like, well, what if we set up something similar to a territory? What happens if we get into Boston? What happens if we get into Worcester? We started running Arts at the Armory at the end of 2015 in Somerville, Massachusetts. You know, by 2016 we were able to run our first live event at Electric Haze in Worcester, Massachusetts. And since then we have been afforded more opportunities to travel to places like Syracuse, New York, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or back to Long Island, New York, where we can perform in front of crowds that are eager to see us because we've never taken Beyond Wrestling to their neck of the woods, but our popularity has grown to the point where they know what we are. The New England wrestling scene is flooded with similar presentation to Beyond Wrestling, which is awesome to think, hey, one of our goals was to bring the type of wrestling that I like to New England, and now it's almost defined independent wrestling in New England. You can't go anywhere without seeing something that Beyond Wrestling hasn't had an influence on. But it's a matter of trying to stay ahead of the pack now, you know, keep ahead of the curve, and I think that's where uncharted territory especially really comes into play, because nobody else in independent wrestling, and only two other companies in all of professional wrestling, have more than 1 million subscribers on their YouTube channel, which gives us a platform that is completely unique, especially in independent wrestling. And it also gives us resources that a lot of other organizations don't have. So it's a matter of what can we do to best utilize what we have to continue to do something different that's still good for the wrestlers and good for professional wrestling.
Vince and Josh, there is no better way to start Beyond with some of the best in Beyond history, EYFBO.
I've been wanting to do weekly live events for years, especially since in the New England area, when I talk to wrestling fans from an older generation, they always reference Jack Witchy's, which was kind of an indoor roller rink in the 70s in Attleboro, Massachusetts, and every Friday night they had professional wrestling. I think it was like $5 or $10 for a ticket, and they had like 5 or 6 matches, but it was such a community event, and everybody knew. Everybody knew. So when I talk to people that are a little bit older, they say, oh, it's like Jack Witchy's, and it's just like, wait, is that something that could be sustainable in 2019? Can we create that kind of community? Because that's how independent wrestlers really get to the next level. I mean, there's so many well-trained and talented athletes on the scene these days, but it's, the difference between, everybody that's getting paid $50 to wrestle on a show and the guys and the girls that are able to tour, across the country and now worldwide every single weekend is the connection that they have with the crowd. And I've always been a firm believer that independent wrestling in a lot of ways is a numbers game, whether it's the repetition of the performances in order to hone your craft or the amount of times that you need to get in front of a crowd before you have that connection. But by doing a live weekly broadcast with uncharted territory, in theory, when we were doing monthly shows, we should now be able to accomplish in 3 months over the course of 12 episodes what would take 12 shows over the course of a year. So I think we're going to be seeing wrestlers kind of coming out of nowhere, catching fire, and pushing professional wrestling forward, especially on an independent level.
This is never going away.